Good morning, all of you. Welcome to the second day of the 17th ICTer Conference 2017. So let me introduce the keynote speaker of today, of the morning session, Professor Geoffrey Crisp. Professor Geoffrey Crisp is Pro Vice Chancellor Education of the University of South Wales, Sydney, Australia. He is responsible for providing leadership in the development and implementation of strategic initiatives in learning and teaching through the effective use of online technologies. He obtained his PhD in chemistry at the Research School of Chemistry, Australian National University in 1981. Although he majored in chemistry, he has a successful track record in interdisciplinary collaborative work in using online technologies to improve teaching and learning environments. After a Humboldt Fellowship at the Max Planck Institute of Mannheim, Daru and postdoctoral positions at Colorado State University and the Australian National University, Professor Crisp began his academic career in the chemistry department at the University of Melbourne. So, the keynote speech for the day. Assessing for Quality Decision Making, Professor Geoffrey Crisp. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much for the kind invitation, and also thank you very much to the University of Colombo, and in particular the School of Computing, for inviting us all here and hosting us very generously. So I would like to thank you all for that. This is my first visit to Sri Lanka, and I am having a very nice time, so thank you all very much. So my talk is going to be a little bit different from some of the others that you've had. You've had some very technical presentations. Mine is about how we go about assessing our students in higher education and how we need to rethink how we assess our students using the affordances of technology. So the reason I've picked this particular slide, this person in the bubble on the water, is actually in response to a number of my colleagues at my current university who get quite irate with me when I say that there are better ways of teaching. And they say, what do you expect us to do, to walk on water? And I say, yes, that is exactly what I expect you to do. It's easy to walk on water, so long as you use a little bit of technology, a little bit of ingenuity, and a little bit of resilience and persistence. You can indeed walk on water. So that's what I expect my colleagues to do. So I'll tell you a little bit about my university. So we are in Sydney, New South Wales in Australia. And this is just a bit of geography to show you all the plan for Sydney. I think many of you would recognise the picture that's up on the top there. So that's our Opera House, which most people see in all the pictures, and also our Sydney Harbour Bridge. We have a very beautiful harbour in Sydney. It's one of the highlights of Australia if ever you come there. And just to show you roughly where our university is, we're just only about 6 kilometres south of the main part of the city. And we are next to a racecourse, which is quite interesting for the history of our university. So on one side of the university we have the racecourse, on the other side, or one of the other sides, we have a hospital, and then we have residential areas. So we're very much a residential type of university in amongst the rest of the community. We have roughly 55,000 students, if you're wondering the sort of size of the university, and around 6,000 professional and academic staff in total for the university. These are some old photos of our university. Now, I put this up just to show you a couple of things about our university. First off, I mentioned to you we're opposite a racecourse, one of the main racecourses in Sydney. The lower campus of my university was actually a racecourse as well. They used to race horses and they used to play polo there, and that's the picture you've got on the right-hand side. The other picture I've got up here in the bottom right-hand side is to highlight that my university has welcomed international students for many decades. We were one of the first universities in Australia to have large numbers of international students, and we still have large numbers. About 35% of our students at my university are international. The other 65 are Australian students. So we welcome our international students, and they're a vibrant part of our community. So that was a little bit about our university. This is what it looks like now. So it's obviously got nice modern buildings, nice facilities. Actually, one of the pleasures of my job is actually designing the classrooms. So we look at how we should design our classrooms and how we should design spaces for our students outside the classrooms as well. It's an important part of the work that we do. We don't actually land planes on the main campus. We do aviation, but we actually land planes a bit further away at the local airport. So now for me to talk a little bit about assessment. Universities are often very traditional when it comes to assessment. They are quite happy to try different ways of teaching students, but when it comes to assessment, they like to be very conservative and very traditional because it's seen as very high stakes. And what I've certainly seen over the last few years is we see people doing all sorts of exciting things in the learning environment with the students, but then giving them a very boring, very conservative, very basic type of exam, which is predominantly based on recall and what you can do with pen and paper in a 2 or 3 hour period. And I must say, those days should be over. We should not be doing that with our students. We should be allowing them to use all the affordances of the technology that we have for them to be able to give us meaningful responses to meaningful assessment tasks. And that's really what I want to encourage you to think about today. So the reason I put these two images up here is one of the questions I ask my own colleagues is, why do you set 3-hour exams or 2-hour exams? Why? What's magic about 2 hours? What's magic about 3 hours? Why is that important? And it actually has nothing to do with pedagogy, but it has everything to do with convenience and how we administer things in a university. So we need to rethink that about why we insist on running these standardized assessments in these very standardized ways. Because if we do that, it means we are going to ask our students very standardized tasks and very standardized questions for them to be able to respond to. So the other thing, sorry, I should have mentioned right up front, the reason I've got this URL here, those of you who have got a device with you, if you go on to the address that I've got there, which is www.zeetings.com, and then do /gcrisp, there you will be able to follow this presentation on your own device. You'll be able to take notes on your own device, and you'll be able to save the presentation if you join up and get a free account with Zeetings. So this is actually my first go at using Zeetings for a presentation, so bear with me if things do not work as well as they should, because I only started using this about a week ago, and I thought this would be a great opportunity to be able to try something new. The other thing is we're going to try a little bit of audience participation and voting during this presentation. So I would encourage you to go onto that website, and we'll get you to vote and respond to some questions that I will ask. Now this is the sort of thing also that you could be doing with your students in your class. So I'm just running this off the wireless network. I just have my presentation on the web, and it means your students could follow that. It means that they could take their own notes on that, and it means you could ask them questions during classes and get them to respond to that. So hopefully, just to give me an idea, have some of you got that on your device now, just so I know? Anyone just want to put up their hand if they've got it on their device yet? Okay, so we have a small number of people. Good, okay. So you'll be able to help your colleagues if they're not sure how to do that. So, those of you who have got it, how about we respond to this first question that we have here? So hopefully those of you who have logged on to Zeetings and gcrisp, you should see this page on your device. So you should be able to vote for this. So the question I'm asking there is, we should assess what is important and not what is easy to assess. Do you agree with that statement or not? You don't have to, right? Just because I'm up here giving a presentation doesn't mean you have to agree with everything that I'm going to say. And this is also the idea of you being able to do it on your own device. It's anonymous. I have no idea who's responding to which question. It's completely anonymous. Are you able to respond? The reason I'm asking is, there we go. We can see the number of responses. I've left this up here so you can see. So we have 3 responses so far. So I'm not sure how many people have actually logged on there. And what you'll notice is the order of those questions is changing, and that's in response to the number of people who are voting for the different options that I have there. So this is a technique that you can use in your class to get students to respond to a question you want to ask them, and you can find out whether students in the class are understanding what you're saying or not. And then you can either slow down if they're not understanding, or you can speed up a bit if everyone has got the idea and you can move on to the next thing. Right? So it is a form of assessment that you're doing. This is a form of formative assessment. So this is where you're asking students whether they're following what's going on. So again, one of the things that we don't do enough of, at least certainly in my university, we don't use enough of this formative assessment to find out whether students are actually understanding what's going on, whether they have understood the key concepts that we are asking them. So I won't spend too long on this one because this was just to show you how this works. And for those of you who are interested, you can sign up for, you can get a free account with Zeetings for a limited number of students in the class that you want to have respond. You have to pay if you want larger numbers of students. So that's how this works. And it looks like most of you already do, you do this already with your students. That's certainly what the majority of people are saying here. So let me go on and just talk a little bit about the type of questions that we ask students. So you can see here the question that I'm asking is, do we actually give students something worthwhile to do during their assessment? Or is it simply something to give them a grade or a mark? Or simply to say, yes, we've tested them and here's the grade distribution, or here are the range of marks that we've got for our students. So there's different things that you can do, but here it's really saying that for something to be correct or incorrect is probably fine when it's a very low-level factual-based task that you're giving students to do. You want to know whether they know something or don't know something. But for most of the things that we want to ask our students, especially in university, is often there is no one correct answer. Often there are a number of responses, and each of them has different consequences. So one of the things that we should be doing with our students, especially our advanced students, is actually getting them to explore different options and explore the different consequences to those options, rather than thinking there is always one correct answer to a question. Most complex problems in the world today do not have a simple answer. There is not a simple response. There is no one correct way of doing something. There are options and there are consequences to those options. So one of the things I would be encouraging you to think about is, how often do you get your students to respond to something that is complex, has a number of options, and what you actually ask the students to do is to justify their options that they have chosen and to talk about the consequences so that they understand the complexities of the type of task that you've asked them to do, rather than just look for a correct or an incorrect answer. So just a little bit of terminology, and again for you to think about your own assessment tasks. When you set a question or when you set a task for students, there's only 2 types of responses that you are expecting from your students. You're either expecting a convergent response or you're expecting a divergent response. And it doesn't matter what the discipline is, it actually doesn't matter what the question is, doesn't matter what the task is that you've asked students, you will get either a convergent or a divergent response. What do we mean by that? Convergent response means you are expecting every student in the class to give the same response. And that's normally what we associate with knowledge or low-level recall. So that's the factual information. So there might be a particular way of doing things in your discipline, and you want all students to know this is the way we do it in our discipline. So that's a convergent response. Other types of responses, though, are the type I talked about before for a complex problem, where there's more than one option that a student can come up with. With that, of course, you want to know what are the consequences to that. So that's what we call a divergent response. So different students can give you a different response. And your role as an assessor right, in these two types of responses is quite different. And traditionally, for computer-based assessment, we've traditionally actually given convergent types of questions, because it's quite easy to write an algorithm that says, if the computer sees this, it's correct. If they see anything else, doesn't matter what it is, it's incorrect. Right? That's usually why a lot of the computer-based assessment is dichotomous like that. You either see it or you don't. And then the student either gets the mark or they don't get the mark. Right? Very traditional. I'm going to talk a little bit about multiple choice questions in a minute and how we can actually start changing some of those to be more divergent rather than convergent. But it's important that you actually let students know whether you are expecting them to give a convergent or a divergent response, because they need to know whether you're going to value variations in the response or whether you want everyone to say exactly the same thing. So one of the really important things to do up front. The other thing is that an assessment task should actually be worth doing, right? So in other words, it should be worth doing beyond just getting a mark or a grade, because if you want to engage the student's mind, then you need to give them something which is actually worthwhile for them to do. If it's simply getting a grade or a mark, then students will be just like a computer or an algorithm, and they will just give you exactly what you want back. Right? That's what they'll do. They won't actually spend a lot of time trying to think of a divergent type of response if all you're going to do is reward a convergent response. So that's why it's important that you think about what you want to reward with the students. And this is one of the things that I talk to, again, my colleagues who complain bitterly about online assessments, saying, well, if we let the students do it on a computer, they're just going to Google it, what the answer is, or they're going to go to Wikipedia, or they're going to find an answer somewhere on the web and just copy and paste it in to a text field. And so my response to that is, if the question you ask, if the correct response can be found on Wikipedia, why are you bothering to ask the student the question in the first place? What's the point? Right? It hasn't actually generated any neuron connections in the student. All they've done is follow a formula about how to give you back exactly what you want. Right? So that's the thing that we need to think about. Why are we asking students questions if they can get the answer just by going onto a computer and finding the exact answer that you want? Right? So that's one of the things that we need to keep thinking about, is why do we do that? And is that actually helping? So here, I just want to encourage you to think about the different types of assessments that we can give students. So I mentioned formative before. Most people are familiar with formative and summative, right? So formative is where the marks or grades don't count towards the final mark or grade, and the purpose of the formative is to give feedback to both the students and to the teacher about how the student's going, about whether they understood the concepts or not. Formative is normally done during learning, so that could be assessment during learning. Summative, again, you're all familiar with that. That tends to be after you've done some learning and we want to know, have students actually understood what's going on? We give them a mark or a grade, and it counts towards their final mark or grade. Usually very little feedback is associated with summative assessment. It is sometimes, but often people don't bother with summative. And also students don't often bother looking at feedback from summative because they think it's over, right? They've done that, they're on to the next thing that they have to do. There are two other types of assessment, though, that you can do with students. One is fairly straightforward, and that's diagnostic assessment. And this is actually what you do before learning. So this is actually to get students to understand, what do I currently know, what don't I know, and what am I going to do about the things that I don't know? So really, before you do anything with your students, you should actually give them a diagnostic. And that diagnostic will help you as the teacher, and will actually help the students as well, to understand what they currently know and where the gaps might be. Because there's actually no point just going on to new concepts with students if they don't actually understand the previous concept that you're going to use as a foundation that you're going to build other things on. So diagnostic, certainly in my university, is probably very underutilised in terms of a form of assessment. But it's one that we should be doing a lot more of. And it's actually one which is perfectly suited to online assessment. You can do online diagnostic very easily, because you can base the questions around key concepts and key ideas, and you can give the students some feedback about whether they understand that key concept or that key idea. Plus you can link to resources that they can use if they're having trouble. So again, it's one of the best uses of low-level online assessment. The bottom one there is relatively new. It has other names. It doesn't have to be called integrative. Integrative assessment here is actually the term I came up with. Wrote a paper on this to describe the difference between assessment for current learning and the assessment for future learning. So we need to let students know, are we assessing them for the current thing that they're doing, or are we actually assessing them for how they will go about doing future learning and future activities? And you might say, why would you bother doing that? There's a lot of research that's done that actually shows that, especially with, say, recall exam type of questions that we ask, students will memorize those for the exam, and then a month later or 2 months later, they've usually forgotten a lot of it, right? And that's because they've only learnt it for the exam, which is why I was making the point to you about what's the purpose of the assessment. Are you just doing it simply to give them a mark or a grade or progression, so they can progress to the next course? The assessment for future learning is actually about the meta-analysis of their understanding. It's actually based on concepts and ideas, and for students to be able to understand how well they go about problem solving. So do you set tasks for students when they can actually analyse their approach to problem solving? Because that is the idea they will take with them to the next activity. That doesn't get lost. Their approach is something that you can actually work with the students on. If they have an approach which is not particularly productive or not particularly helpful to their learning, then you can actually help them with that to have a much better approach to their learning. So that's the idea of integrative assessment, and it's about future learning. So I'm going to skip a couple of these and just move on. As I said, you'll be able to get a copy of all of these, because I want to just talk a little bit about the variety of assessment tasks that you have available for your students. So this is a big long list. You could probably come up with some others. This is some work we did a couple of years ago on a project that I was involved in, where we actually went around surveying different disciplines at a number of universities in Australia about how many different types of assessment tasks did they use during their programs and during their courses or subjects. And we found that some types of assessment are favoured by some disciplines, and some disciplines don't use some forms of assessment at all. And what we were trying to do is to show people that there's actually a wide variety of assessment task types that you can use. And often it's good to talk to people from another discipline. So I know most people here are from computer science. You probably have favourite forms of assessment that you use in computer science. One of the things that you would benefit from is actually talking to people from other disciplines to find out what forms of assessment they use, what types of tasks do they set their students. So quite frankly, you'd be well served to go and talk to people from completely different disciplines to you. Go and talk to people in music or art or business, or even go and talk to medicine, and see how do they assess students in those environments, because it will probably prompt you to think about how you might use some of those task types in your own discipline, and start asking students different types of questions. Again, my background's chemistry, so I was very used to using a very narrow set of assessment task types with my students. And because I've left chemistry now and I don't do anymore, I know that I could do a much better job now that I understand a lot more about assessment and how we might actually assess students in different ways compared to what I used to do when I used to teach there. But that's really just to encourage you to think about the wide variety of things you have available. So again, if you'd like, you can vote on this one and let me know whether you think you use more than 5 different types of assessment task types, or do you just use 5 or fewer task types. Okay, you can see the percentages coming up there. And it looks like most of you use a variety of task types. So and again, that's very excellent to see. And look, I'm not telling you how you should teach. This is really just getting you to reflect on the way in which you teach, and are there other things that you could be doing. So that's really the whole point of this presentation. I'm glad we've got more people logged on now, so we've got at least 12, so that's good. So again, you can see how you can use this quite effectively in your classes as well with your students to be able to see whether they understand a key concept or a key idea. So I'm going to talk, just give a couple of examples now. So this is some examples of some work I did when I was back in chemistry. And what we wanted to do is we knew that all our colleagues were going to use multiple choice questions. Because our learning management system, it was easy to do a multiple choice question. Most academics are familiar with the multiple choice question. Most academics write pretty ordinary multiple choice questions. That's fine. That's what they're used to. but we wanted to say, well, how can we take the format that people are familiar with, both academics and students, because students are very familiar with the multiple choice. Multiple choice is just an example of what we call a selected response format. So there's other types of selected response formats. Things like yes, no, true, false, multiple choice, hotspots. There's all sorts of different things you can use with your learning management system now. But what we wanted to do is to say, well, could we ask a different type of question, but using a multiple choice format? So what we did here was just some examples, and you'll see all three of these examples that I've got here. And what I'll do is I'll just play a video for you while I talk. And I'm going to do it the safe way. You can actually do this through the Zeetings, but I've had a little bit of problem just running this through this system here, so I'm doing them as separate YouTube videos here. So this is just running through what it would look like from a student's point of view, doing one of these, what we call interactive multiple choice questions. And what we've done here is we've actually just put a hypertext link inside the multiple choice question, and it just opens up a second browser window. So the student here toggles between two browser windows. So they just use the browser window in their learning management system to read the question and answer to put in their response, but they use the tool to actually interrogate what it is. This happens to be a periodic table, right? Very straightforward thing that chemistry students have to do. But instead of giving them a static version of the periodic table, we've actually given them access, as you can see here, to a full set of data for each of the elements. That means we could actually change the question that we ask the students here, because we can ask students to compare and contrast different elements based on their properties. And they don't have to memorize that. They don't have to have a textbook that they, going through the pages. You could do something like this with an open book exam. It's just that it would take longer for the student to do that, because they've got to find all those bits of information. Whereas here, you can give them ready access to the digital information that they have. So the types of examples we did here, you saw the one for the periodic table. The other thing in chemistry, what's a really important thing for students to be able to do is to manipulate molecules in 3 dimensions. So they need to be able to rotate molecules. They need to be able to see 3-dimensional orientation. So those of you who have done chemistry might even recognize, top right-hand side there, they're actually 3 different molecules. But they represent 3 different 3-dimensional arrangements. So rather than, in the old days, we used to get students to have little physical models, and they'd build the little model, and then they'd rotate it and look at it and do that. The advantage here, of course, is it's much faster to do it through the technology. But the other advantage with this is the tool that they're accessing here allows them to measure things about the molecules. So they can measure bond angles, bond distances. They can compare and contrast again. So you can see that we're actually changing the type of question that we're asking students from a straight recall question to a more compare and contrast or analyse or evaluate type of question, simply by giving them access to a tool that they can interrogate. So this was quite successful doing this, because the technology was a very low threshold for the academics and the students. The academics didn't have to learn any new techniques here. All they had to do, they could just use their normal multiple choice question, but just hypertext link to the tool. And then the students, it was very easy for them to use this. So we did quite a few of these in all sorts of different disciplines. This is an example from business that we did. So this was embedding Excel spreadsheets with macros in them. So what a student could do is anything in yellow that I've got there, the student can change those values. And when they change the values, the graph over on the right-hand side changes. One of the other advantages of doing this, of course, is that you can give different students different values in their question. Not every student has to get the same value. And that means the response they give is actually going to be different, because you're not asking them for a numerical response. This is a conceptual question. So you're now moving from a straight recall or a formulaic question, put these data into a formula and give me out the answer, to actually saying to them, do you understand the concept? And by giving students different sets of data, sometimes the graph will go up, sometimes it'll go down, sometimes it'll do something different, and the student has to actually understand that concept to be able to answer the question. Now again, students could still guess what the answer is. This hasn't changed that aspect of a selected response. But it does mean that the student is actually thinking more, but still using a multiple choice or selected response format for the question. So again, very simple thing. for students to be able to use. This one, my humanities colleagues always said to me, well, that's all very well for things that are based on numbers or images or something like that. What can you do for us in the humanities for this online, online assessment? So one of the things we came up with here was to integrate things like videos and three-dimensional objects. So for art and design, we showed examples of a statue or a painting where you could move around the painting, move around the statue. For our architecture students, we used to show buildings. You could go inside a building, you could move around inside the building, and that way you could ask questions about that. This particular example that I've got here is actually the Bayeux Tapestry. So the Bayeux Tapestry is a depiction of the Battle of Hastings in England. And the traditional way of asking a question about the Battle of Hastings is that you would give the students a static picture of the Bayeux Tapestry. The problem there is the original to the Bayeux Tapestry is 70 metres long. So you can't actually give the students the whole 70 metres because there'd be in a picture, because there's no detail when you do that. So the other thing that people would do is they would take a slice, so they'd take maybe this picture that I've got here, but the problem with that is every student gets exactly the same picture. That means every student, you're asking a convergent type of response from the students, because you've given every student exactly the same segment of the Bayeux Tapestry, which means the question that you can ask them has to be based just on that one image that everyone is going to get. If you give the students access to the whole 70 metres live in the middle of an assessment, and then ask students to pick the segment of the Bayeux Tapestry that illustrates the response that they're going to make, then that actually means you are actually getting them to think at a higher level, because they have to make a judgment about which part of the Bayeux Tapestry they're going to use. And of course you can get students to do things like screen capture for the part of the Bayeux Tapestry, and they can upload that as part of their response. So again, very simple things technically for students and staff to be able to do. So again, I'll just do this quickly. I won't show the video for this one, but you can do the same thing with remote labs. So there's lots of places around the world now that actually have pieces of equipment that are connected to the internet, and you can remotely access that. So in this case here, this is a digital interface on the left-hand side, but the real experiment is running in real time over on the right-hand side. And you can actually get students to go in and actually change the data, change the input, and then get them to run a simulation, and then you can ask them questions about that. Again, the advantage is you can give different data sets to different students to be able to run. Now, I know in computer science you already do things like that, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that one. One I will talk to you about, there's two of my favourite forms of assessment, scenario-based learning and role plays, because you can set very complex problems for students to do in online role plays or online scenario-based learning. In this case, this is a piece of software that came out of University of Queensland called Scenario-Based Learning Interactive. You can do it lots of different ways. You don't have to use this software. This just happens to be a nice version of it. Let me see if I can find that here. Oh no, that's not it. SBLI, here we go. So what this will do is just show you what it looks like from a student's point of view. So in this case, you set up a scenario for students, and they have decision points, which are just branch points in this scenario. But at that decision point, you can get students to write down what they were thinking at those decision points. So that actually gives you a way of capturing what the student was thinking during the scenario. It also means that you can give them the option of going down a particular path, realising that they've either made a mistake or it's not a productive path, and being able to come back again, and then being able to go down a productive path. So here, this is an example of assessing for quality decision making here, because what you're doing is you're not assessing recall, you're actually assessing the quality of the decision that the student made. And this is actually an example of integrative assessment as well about future learning, because you get students to describe what they were thinking at the time they made the decision. And then you capture that, and that's actually what you assess, is actually the quality of the decision making. So this is just going through all the pretty stuff that it has in here, but the idea here is to capture quality decision making that students do. So again, I will move on a little bit. from this one. If you don't mind, I won't do this one because I think you've got the idea here. There's a lot of high-level simulations that are out there. Some are free to use, some are not free to use. Some of them are based on MOOCs. You know, you can incorporate MOOCs into what you do and get students to be able to do things inside a MOOC and then assess them outside the MOOC. This one is from the US about hab worlds. My university has a partnership with Arizona State University and King's College London, and this is some work that's done at Arizona State University. Again, they're really just about simulations. Smart Sparrow is an example of adaptive learning, and again, this is about branching. So as I said to you, there's lots of different software that you can use. You computer scientists, you're very familiar with branching as well. But what I would encourage you to do is to try and capture decision making at those points in the branches where you set that up for students and make the decision points aligned with key concepts or key ideas so that then you can give feedback to the students about whether they understand that key concept or that key idea. Smart Sparrow is another bit of software that started out of my university, University of New South Wales. And again, this is based on adaptive learning where students can take different paths. And for students who understand the key concepts, they can move much faster than students who perhaps don't understand all the key concepts, and it takes them through a slower path to make sure that they understand those key concepts. And again, we're applying this at the moment to assessment, where we say to, where we're working with students to, where students can actually do assessments at different times. So not every student is actually ready to do an assessment at exactly the same time. And this is one of the big challenges that I've had in particular at my university. We have, at the moment, we have 13-week semesters. We have 2 13-week semesters and then a small summer semester. We're moving to 3 10-week semesters in 2019. So we're redesigning all of our courses, units in the whole university at the moment for 10 weeks rather than 13 weeks. But one of the issues that's come up is, why do students have to wait 10 weeks or 13 weeks to be able to do the assessment? Some of them would actually be ready after 7 weeks or 8 weeks or 6 weeks. Other students might actually take 15 weeks to be ready to do the assessment. So we need to be able to have assessment task types and formats where we can actually allow students to take assessments at different times. And that's where this work is starting to move in terms of the adaptive assessment. And again, because it's based on different inputs that you can have in there, different students will get different inputs when they start the journey here. So a student can't just go through and then tell all the other students what the answer is, because it's actually going to be different for every student who starts the journey through these adaptive learning approaches. The BEST network is a thing that was again set up through University of New South Wales. This is mainly for health science area, and it uses all the adaptive learning that I've just talked about there. So again, you'll have access to all of these URLs, but these are basically simulations. And you can include these simulations, you could link to these simulations during an assessment and actually get students to answer questions about how they actually work through this. So that idea of separating the question from the tool is one that you can use in lots of different scenarios, right? It's a very powerful way of being able to ask students much higher level questions. So again, I'll just move on a little bit because I want to, in fact, I won't show you that one. I want to talk about another type of assessment. And this is, again, a little bit controversial in many universities. But I was talking to some colleagues here yesterday, I think it was, about some work that we've been doing around what we call negotiated assessment. This is actually where we get the students to design the task, not the academic. And the way we do that is we give them a rubric and we say, here is the rubric for this assessment task, here are the key learning outcomes, here are the criteria that you have to show that you've met those learning outcomes. And here are the standards. So this is what a high distinction might look like, this is what a distinction might look like, this is what a credit. Now you go away, and we normally get them to do it in groups, you go away and design an assessment task where you can show us that you have met all of these learning outcomes, and if you want a high distinction, you show us why you deserve a high distinction. What is it that you're going to do which will show us you meet the standard for a high distinction? And it's called negotiated because the students then have to come back to the academic and negotiate that assessment task. So the students, sometimes the academic says, no, that's not a good task, or no, that isn't showing me that you would meet the standard for a high distinction for this. So they have to go away and do it, start again in their design. But the idea is that this involves students much more in quality assessment. So rather than assessment being something done to them, they actually then think about, well, actually, yeah, I now understand why the academic may have set a particular task for me to do in the past, because it was trying to test these learning outcomes and for me to be able to show I met these particular standards. So I'll just show a short video for this one because it's quite interesting. I think it's quite interesting about the negotiated assessment. No, you don't want to know that I have a board meeting coming up next week. So this was my previous university, RMIT University, which is where I was before my current one.
I realised there were some students who in class were very verbally competent, they were insightful, but as soon as they had to start writing, something got lost. And I wanted these students to be able to shine because they knew their stuff, but in a way other than writing essays. Negotiated assessment is a technique by which students, as a group, as a class in our case, we decide what our assessment tasks will be.
Well, Catherine put it to us that we had to design our own assessment task.
She actually had us thinking about it, and it was something completely new.
You're learning how to apply the knowledge that you've researched.
And we literally sat down, we had them in table groups, we used the whiteboards, we talked about what certain groups would do, and then we brought it together as one whole.
So everyone got input, it wasn't just from our lecturer deciding how she was going to mark it.
And out of that one whole, we came up with about 7 ideas of what the...
So you can see that the students, and we interviewed lots of students for this one, and one of the best comments that I thought I actually read from the students when we did the focus groups was one of the students said, "Do you know, I should have just done the exam, it would have been a lot easier." Because what most of the students found, or what we found, was that they actually spent far more time because they were actually actively involved in designing the assessment task. And because it was a task that they had designed, they actually put more work into doing it. And the quality of the work was actually much higher than had we just done a standard form of assessment for those students. So again, a very powerful thing that you can do with students. So, let's go on. So the last thing that I want to introduce you to was one of my colleagues, Matthew Hillier, who works at Monash University. He worked with me on an earlier project we did called Transforming Assessment, where we wanted to change the earlier work that I showed you. And now Matthew has done some additional work, which I think is actually quite interesting. And this is what he calls e-exams. And this is actually about putting an entire exam or a series of exams on a USB stick. And actually the students come into the exam room. So what he wanted to do was to match what happens in a traditional exam situation, but actually be able to use computers, and for students to be able to bring their own device because they're familiar with their own device. So rather than having a big computer lab with many computers in there, the idea was we could still use any of the ordinary facilities that we had, and the students brought their own device in, and certainly in Australia most students would have a device, and if not, then we always had a few loan ones that they could borrow for the exam. And then instead of handing out an exam paper, the students were given a USB stick, and on the USB stick was their entire exam. And Matthew he uses all open source software for this. It works on Macs and PCs and Androids and everything. It doesn't matter what you put in there. There's a lot of technical issues with doing that, as you might imagine, and every now and then they do have problems, especially with students who might have an old computer or running an old operating system. So there's those sorts of issues, but it's actually been quite successful. And it's actually been very successful for academics to rethink their paper-based exams. Because again, Matthew did the same thing that we did in terms of the multiple choice questions. He started from where academics and students have traditionally been. And he said, well, how can we keep the same format that you're familiar with, and how could we change it a little bit? By putting it all on the USB stick, what he could do, of course, is integrate audio and video and simulations and all those things that I just showed you before so that students could have access to that in the middle of what is a traditional paper-based exam, right? So they could have access to all of those resources, and they could do all of that on their own computer. So again, quite a interesting way of being able to take a traditional format and turn it into a non-traditional format. So I'm going to finish here in a minute. This is if you're interested in some of the examples that we've got, transformingassessment.com is the website that we set up with many of the examples here, and Transforming Exams is the one that my colleague Matthew Hillier has done. So both those websites are maybe worth you to look at. And this is my last slide. And a few years ago, I had the opportunity to go to Canada to give some talks. And one of the things that I really enjoyed in Canada was the Inuit, or the Indigenous, the First Nations people in Canada. And one of the things that you see is in the remote locations in the north of Canada, where snow covers most of the ground most of the time, there are no features. It's featureless because everything is just covered in snow. So it's very hard to know where you are, where you've come from, and where you have to go to. Now, I know you might tell me just use a GPS, and perhaps you could, but the Inuits didn't have GPS in their traditional days. So what they did was they used these things called inukshuks. And an inukshuk is, you've probably seen these, where it's just stones piled on each other, but they're piled on each other to look like a person. And what really struck me about that was when I started looking up the meaning that the Inuit put against an inukshuk. And the inukshuk there for them was a sign first that someone had been here before, so someone had come this way, so you knew that someone else had already been there. But also it said to people, you are on the right path. And the reason that this struck me as important is this is what I think academics should be like. Academics, we should be the inukshuk to our students. We should be showing them the path and the fact that we have gone there before and that they can follow. So it really struck me as a metaphor for what academics should be doing. So I just want to thank you for your attention, and I think we may have some time for a few questions. That's it. Yep. So are there any questions or comments you would like to make? Yeah, Masa.
There are so many ideas, and I love them, but do you have any, sorry. So there are so many, is it working?
Yeah, it's on.
So many ideas, and I really like them, but do you have some feedback from the students? What attracts them the most? What's the most interesting form of learning for them?
Look, it's a very good question, and I don't think there's any one approach that is favoured by all students. I think students are very diverse. So I'll be honest with you, some students do want to know just what's on the exam. Just tell me what I need to do and I'll do it. I have other parts of my life that I am more interested in. All I want to do is get the qualification or whatever it is. So, and we know that, and I understand that. And I think that is as it is. One of the things, though, as a general principle, the more you involve students engaging them in the assessment process, whether that's through negotiated assessment, whether it's giving them tools or access to resources that they can use, which make the assessment task more interesting, whether you the other thing you may have seen on the slide there, it talked about inclusive assessment. So what we tried to do there was another project I was involved in, to make assessment more inclusive to a wide diversity of students. So one of the things, just in answer to your question as well, you may have heard of people talking about learning styles, right? So different students have different learning styles, and you would all have different learning styles as well. Some of you like to just listen. Right? Some like to just listen to someone speak. Others like to read, right? And others like to work in groups because they like to talk. They like to talk through the idea because then it becomes more real for them when they actually articulate it and speak it. So that's for learning. It's exactly the same thing with assessment, though. Different students favour different types of assessment modes. So there's no one type of assessment mode that every student loves. They're all going to be different. So that's why I started this by saying to you about the variety of task types that we have and the fact that we have to use a variety of task types. Because if you just keep using the same task type over and over again, you are favouring only a particular type of student. Right? So the idea is to, if you want to be inclusive and have, to include more diversity in your assessment task, then try the different task types. So that's also why I went through a number of different things, because and again, it's not to say you should use all of these or even any one of these in particular. Every person will have to think about their own units and their own students and their own subject and the discipline and say, well, what will work for us and for our students? Yeah.
Thank you for the nice talk and small question. Teaching and learning process, the assessment is something that takes place within the process, what we, as you showed, the continuous assessment, and at the end we have a formative and the summative, those combination. Yeah. And most of the time those things are linked with the so-called learning outcomes that we define at the beginning of the process by the teachers, and students are supposed. Now, what I have seen, students are very serious about achieving these grades in the courses, so they wanted to pass the exams. More than concentrating on the learning process, they are concentrating on the getting through the exam, so-called exam-oriented process. And then the people sometimes fail in the exam. So let's suppose someone doing a good project, but he fails in the final presentation to convince his idea, so he gets a bad grade in kind of thing. And if there isn't a way, if we have a framework where we actually monitor the whole process of his work, maybe now, let's assume it is in context of computing. Sometimes you give the students a project to develop a software. Yeah. So even, so the person is usually on online environment, he can do the whole thing, design the stuff, programming and the work, and he comes. And finally he may come and present the thing, and where the examiners will look at his work and will decide a grade. But the examiner doesn't see the whole picture of what the person has actually done during the whole thing. So if the system could provide some sort of a service, some sort of a feedback for the examiners, okay, he may fail, whatever his presentation may be failed, but if the teacher see the whole picture, so I think it will be a much more effective. I mean, the whole thing will provide more confidence from the learner's point of view. The assessment become much more effective. I have seen the same thing on the opposite way. Some people have not done a good work, they come for the presentation, they do some nice talk and get an attraction and get a good grade, but inside nothing at all. So because we are very concerned about the point of the assessment rather than the process of the whole learning and things what has happened.
Yeah, that's right. And you bring up the really good point about product and process, right? So often, and again, just to go on a little bit about assessment, we often look at the product that either a student or a group of students has created, and then we judge the product. And we make assumptions and inferences. So when you actually assess a student, most of us are actually inferring what the student must have learned from what they present to us, so whatever the product is. And then we make a judgment and say, well, if the product looks like this, then we assume they must have been thinking this, 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 and this. That was the reason I liked or made the comment about scenario-based learning, in particular about branching and about capturing the decision points that students go through when they're actually designing a product or when they're doing something. So you could do that now. I mean, even in computer science, presumably when you give students something to do, you could actually have key points in there and actually say to the students, even when you're doing coding, at these particular points here, you need to keep a journal or some document that actually tells us what you were thinking when you wrote those lines of code at particular points. And you don't have to do it for all, 1,000 lines of code or something. What you do is you pick out the ones that are important for the key concepts or the key ideas that are important for those learning outcomes. And then when the student does present, you've also got this journal or whatever it is that the student has done. Journal is probably the most obvious one because you can do that in all the learning management systems. Or even they can just keep a Word document as a journal to go through, and then they present that as well. So the examiner will have the journal, which is actually based on key concepts, key ideas, key points throughout the assessment. And then you can use that to actually help you make those judgments. So even if the student fails, you can then look at that and say, well, they failed because at this point here, they didn't understand that key concept. So they made a whole lot of mistakes after that. And of course they were going to make mistakes because back here, they didn't understand a key concept. Any other questions or comments?
Two questions. One is, so when you cater to all these different learning styles and these abilities, do you get enough of a differential between the students? I mean, how do you kind of, because people are, the industry, I mean, have you got, so second part of it is, have you got feedback from the industry or from, I don't know, higher education or whatever, for how well your assessment actually turns out?
Yeah, and again, a very good question. So I can give a couple of bits of feedback on that one. So the first thing is the type of university my current university is, University of New South Wales. It's a research-intensive university in Australia. It is very competitive to get into our university. So we end up with students who are very good at doing exams because if they come straight from school, they normally have very high marks, very high grades to get into our university. These students are also very competitive with each other. They are all after the highest GPA, the grade point average. They are after the highest one that they can obtain. So they are often very suspicious when we change the assessment. And that's because they have been very successful at working out what's required in very traditional forms of assessment, because that's how they got to the university in the first place. So they want to see more of that because they're good at that. But what it means is we end up turning out people who are all like little clones of each other, right? They all look the same because they're all very good, which is fine, but they all have a very similar way of thinking because they've all practiced how to do well in these very traditional forms of assessment. So one of the biggest problems we have is actually convincing students that these other forms of assessment will actually be good for them when they go out into the workplace. It won't actually necessarily give them a higher grade while they're at university. And that's what they're worried about, because they're worried about how do I get a good grade? How do I get a high grade? And they think, and again, because our university probably doesn't think everyone should get a high distinction, it thinks only a small number of people should get a high distinction. And again, we have problems if some of our academics give out too many high distinctions, because their colleagues say, why are you giving out all these high distinctions? Surely your students can't be that good. And what we find normally is it's because you change the assessment and students do really well, because you're actually now getting the students who aren't necessarily the best at doing the exam, but they can do other things really well. And so they actually start getting high distinctions then. So that's why some colleagues get very suspicious of this. What feedback do we have from industry? In Australia, the biggest feedback we get from industry is not the knowledge or understanding of our students. It's actually things like leadership, it's their ability to work in a group, it's their ability to get on with a wide variety of people that they will have to work with in the workplace. And these are traditionally things we do not assess in a typical exam. So we do not put high weighting on that. So one of the things we are now starting to do is to put more weighting on that, because that is the feedback we get from industry. Industry will assume our students know things, right? They'll assume that they've learned something. What they want to know is, are you going to be a good fit for my company? Are you going to get on with all the people in this company? What sort of person are you like to work with? They're the sorts of things that industry is actually asking us. Any other comments or questions? No, looks like we might, is that right? We might be able to finish now? I don't want to stop anyone if there was anyone else who wanted to ask a question. Okay, one more. Sorry.
Thanks for the nice presentation, and there's a quick question. With the compact time frame to conduct 2 credits or 3 credits course for a period of time, is it possible to conduct a couple of assessment with the different methods? That's a concern because you need to finish the lectures, you need to finish the assessments, and also to release the results on time.
And look, it's a very good question. And again, I think we have to be a bit practical about this as well. Certainly many of the things that I showed here will be more time and more effort for the academic to set up, at least initially. After a while, you'll get the return on your time, but it does take more time to do initially. It does take the students a bit more time if you haven't actually given them time to practice. One of the things that we found with our students, especially as we started doing more of this online type of assessment that's more interactive, you need to include all of these things in the learning that the students do so they get familiar with it. Because they get very, very worried if you just introduce something new, like a new tool or a new way of doing something, just in an exam or towards the end or something like that. So you are right, we do have to be pragmatic and practical about how we do this. I'd certainly suggest to people, if you want to try something, just try one small thing. Don't try and do too many things. Don't do too many different things. Just try 1 or 2 small things and then see how the students respond. And the other really important lesson that we learnt is to bring the students along on the journey. So if you're going to change something, always make sure you involve the students in the change so they understand what the change is going to be about. Because students will respond very badly if you change something very quickly and they didn't know about it and they didn't have time to practice or they didn't have time to understand what it is that you've done and why you've changed it. So definitely bring the students along on the journey. And we find actually most students are quite happy to come along on that journey with you. But as I said, I wouldn't be changing too many things too quickly. So I think given the time, we better stop there so we can move on to the rest. So thank you very much, everyone.
Yeah, thank you very much,